how remote work increases accessibility, which widens the talent pool. That's coming up next on this episode of Telecom Newsbytes, brought to you by 911 Inform. I'm your host, Mark Fletcher, and I'm Vice President of Public Safety Solutions at 911 Inform. Here's your Newsbytes for Monday, January 24th, 2022. The shift to remote work has meant that tools once pitched as reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities are now mainstream. And what happens is that's opened up a previously underutilized hiring group for state and local government. 1 million people with disabilities lost their jobs as the pandemic took hold in 2020. That's just one of the major negative impacts that the lockdown and the general economic downturn had on the disabled community. For a sense of scale, there are 1.9 million individuals with disabilities of working age from 18 to 64, and that's just in the state of California alone. But there is much more to it. As discussed many times in the magazine pre-pandemic, telework was a tough sell for government. A few jurisdictions had limited pilot programs in place. Fewer still had a formal, limited remote work allowance for certain kinds of jobs. But the closing of buildings forced large-scale telework, and most employers, even governments, had to admit that remote work was a potential option. According to Respectability, a nonprofit advocacy group, remote work was not considered a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But that might be changing. The main reason for this is that incredible advances in many assistive technologies, both the technologies themselves and the widespread availability that they offer. What used to be assistive is now in many cases mainstream. Take live captioning, for example, which has gone from an expensive add-on of inconsistent quality to a mainstream offering, often available by default on most commonly used platforms. This evolution opens up new opportunities in the workforce for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Similarly, speech-to-text has matured, and by leaps and bounds in recent years, also becoming a mainstream technology. Think Siri, Alexa, and Google for just a few examples. What initially started out as an accessibility accommodation for people with disabilities has now become something that everybody uses, said Philip Kahn-Pauley, Policy and Practices Director for Respectability. Kahn-Pauley said that when that accommodation becomes normalized, it creates greater inclusion for workers with disabilities to participate in the workforce, to be able to contribute, and to collaborate with others. As a matter of fact, it's unlikely that the fastest typists can match the output of someone composing their memo or other office communication using speech-to-text, something I'm doing to dictate this blog right now. Just consider the possibilities that represents for people unable to type. For me, not because I'm physically unable to, but because I just suck at it. Kahn-Pauley also points out that several favorable government policies in recent years are enabling greater inclusion of people with disabilities into the workforce. In a provision of the Federal Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2014, it directed federal contractors to hire and train people with disabilities. Additionally, many state and local jurisdictions also have explicit programs, all aimed at greater inclusion for employment. And together, all of these forces are moving the needle in a positive direction. The labor force participation rate for people with disabilities is nearly 3% higher today than it was before the pandemic. There's an opportunity here for people in state and local government who struggle to recruit talent. While many technology leaders support and are actively engaged in the various partnerships with local schools, they should also consider how they can support this underutilized talent pool. With all the recent talk of considering candidates with non-traditional backgrounds for hard-to-fill cybersecurity and other IT positions, people with disabilities should be on that list. Disability advocates like Kahn-Pauley smartly describe their clients as problem solvers by nature who are constantly confronted with completing tasks able-bodied people can do without a second thought. In fact, he suggests they're ahead of the curve, asking for remote work for years when many thought it was impossible. The very thing that people with disabilities were saying was the solution that everybody else now realizes, he said. I think it really demonstrates the talent and value that workers with disabilities bring to the table that can drive change. And when change is being driven by people with lived experience, I think we can all see the transformation results that come from that. For myself, I can tell you that sitting for several terms on the Federal Communications Commission, Emergency Access Advisory Committee, the Disability Advisory Committee, and various other initiatives that need to include the disabled community, my eyes were opened considerably to including accommodations for this wide community of individuals. You can go to fcc.gov and search on the Disability Advisory Committee for the work that they're doing to close this critical communications gap. That wraps up this episode of Telecom Newsbytes, brought to you by 911 Inform, delivering next-generation 911 solutions for the enterprise today and making every second count when it matters the most. Visit them on the web at 911inform.com. I'm Mark Fletcher, and I'm Vice President of Public Safety Solutions at 911 Inform. Follow me on Twitter at Fletch911. View all of my blogs and podcasts on Fletch.tv. And remember to like and subscribe below so you'll be notified when a new podcast is published. Telecom Newsbytes is published every Monday through Friday and is available on most podcast platforms such as iTunes, Spotify, and the iHeartRadio network. Thanks so much for listening. We'll catch you next time. Take care.